She walked into the bank. They said she could never own, with nothing but a worn coat, a battered sack, and a truth that had waited half a century to be heard. They laughed at her. They sneered, until she opened her bag, and history bled out onto the marble floor. This is not just a story about a woman fighting for a bank. It's a story about stolen dreams, buried legacies, and the courage to stand tall when the world demands you disappear. Today, you're about to witness a reckoning that no amount of time could silence. The automatic glass doors of Chase Bank whispered open as the late afternoon sunlight poured in, stretching golden rays across the cool marble floor. Inside, the air was quiet and orderly, filled with the soft tapping of heels, the rhythmic clicking of keyboards, and the occasional ring of a service bell. But then, without warning, the calm was disturbed not by noise, but presence. A woman stepped in. She was old, unmistakably so, her back slightly hunched beneath the weight of a life far heavier than the faded canvas sack slung over her shoulder. Her long and tattered coat bore the stains of years and the patches of someone who refused to let go of what little she had. Her hair, a silver cloud of tight curls, framed a dark, wrinkled face that held no fear, only calm determination. She walked slowly, each step echoing like a quiet challenge across the polished floor. Her shoes, cracked and nearly split at the seams, made no sound, but the way she carried herself spoke volumes. It wasn't just the way she ignored the stares, or how her gaze remained forward and unwavering. It was something deeper, like she belonged there in a way no one could yet understand. The first reaction came in whispers. A well-dressed woman in pearls clutched her designer purse tighter, pulling it to her chest with a look of veiled panic. A young white banker near the service desk leaned toward his coworker, snickering. She must have wandered in from the shelter. Poor thing. His colleague smirked, shaking his head with mock sympathy, neither of them bothering to whisper softly enough to hide their words. Behind the glass counters, the security guard, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Stephen Miller, looked up, his brows furrowing with that particular blend of irritation and disdain reserved for things that disrupted his neatly ordered world. He placed a firm hand on his holster, and not out of necessity, but to assert the line he believed she was crossing. Still, the old woman walked forward, seemingly unbothered. She reached the center of the lobby, her presence stopping conversations mid-sentence, pulling eyes toward her as if by gravity. And then, without raising her voice, without any preamble, she said the words that shattered the room's illusion of control. "This bank belongs to me." For a breathless second, silence. And then laughter, cold, cutting, explosive. It started with a chuckle near the back, then snowballed into open guffaws from all corners of the room. Someone clapped mockingly. Another muttered, "Is she insane?" Even the tellers behind the counter struggled to hide their amusement. But amid the eruption of mockery, the old woman did not flinch. Her eyes remained fixed, her shoulders square. She did not speak again. She didn't need to, because she knew far better than anyone else in that room that laughter would be short-lived. That truth, when it came, would silence even the cruelest sneer. The laughter echoed like shattered glass across the high ceilings of the bank, sharp and merciless, bouncing from one marble wall to the next, amplifying the cruelty in every chuckle. It wasn't the kind of laughter that came from confusion. It was the kind rooted in contempt, the sound people make when they believe they're better than you, when they're convinced you are nothing but a joke dressed in rags. The old woman, Eleanor C.K. Kirby, stood still in the center of it all, not shrinking away, not blinking, as if each sneer and smirk passed through her without leaving a mark. But inside, she felt it, the sting, the burn, the memory of being laughed at not once, not twice, but her entire life. Stephen Miller took 2 slow steps toward her, the muscles in his jaw tightening, his posture stiff with performative authority. His boots struck the floor harder than necessary, like punctuation marks to a sentence of intimidation. He didn't speak yet, but the way he rested his hand on the butt of his gun made his intent clear. He was ready to remove this problem like any other disturbance, without question, without thought. "Hey," he finally said, voice dripping with false patience. "The kind you reserve for a child you think is slow. This ain't a place for you to play queen. You need to turn around and leave. Now." Around them, more whispers. A pair of young male tellers near the counter exchanged a cruel laugh. "She's probably senile," one of them muttered. "These people always have some fantasy, like they're owed something." The other scoffed. Maybe she thinks it's still 1950 and the banks run out of the back of a church. Their laughter died when Eleanor turned her gaze toward them. Not with anger, but with a strange, piercing stillness, like the gaze of someone who had watched dreams die and been reborn from their ashes. She looked at Stephen next, straight into his eyes, not blinking. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said, her voice calm but laced with iron. "I came to take back what was stolen from me, something your bank took more than 50 years ago." The room didn't fall silent this time. It held its breath. There was a shift, subtle but powerful, a ripple of discomfort as the words hung heavy in the air. James Temp, the bank manager, who had been watching from behind his polished glass office, now stepped forward, his expression a mask of practiced professionalism. Though his eyes betrayed an uneasy flicker, he adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and spoke as if trying to sweep dust under an ornate rug. "Ma'am, perhaps you're mistaken. This bank has been owned by the Matthews family for generations. Maybe you're confusing it with something else from your past." His tone was gentle, almost patronizing, but beneath it was a tremor of something deeper fear. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She knelt slowly, her knees crackling beneath the weight of time, and placed her old canvas sack on the cold marble floor. Her fingers, worn and weathered, reached for the string. "Then I suggest," she said quietly, "you watch closely, because the past is about to stand right in front of you." All eyes in the bank fixated on the canvas sack as Eleanor's aged hand slowly tugged at the frayed string, her every movement deliberate, like someone opening a sealed memory she had carried too long. The room was still, but the silence was no longer filled with mockery. It had thickened, grown uneasy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Stephen Miller, still hovering nearby, shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening on his belt as though bracing for something irrational. But even he couldn't explain why he hesitated to interrupt her now, as the last knot came undone. Eleanor opened the bag with the reverence of a woman revealing not just objects, but the shattered pieces of a life erased. Slowly, carefully, she withdrew the first item, a heavy, weathered leather ledger, its corners frayed, its surface faded, but embossed with the unmistakable imprint, Chase Bank Ledger, 1938. The golden letters, dulled by time, still gleamed with enough authority to silence even the most skeptical mind. Gasps rippled through the lobby like sudden wind, some barely audible, others sharp and involuntary. Eleanor straightened, holding the ledger aloft with both hands as if it were a sacred text. "This," she said, her voice clear and echoing across the marble and glass, "is the original record of the founding of Chase Bank. My name, Eleanor C.K. Kirby, is written on the very first page. I laid the first brick. I funded the first account. I am not confused. I am not mistaken. This bank was built with my blood and my dreams." She placed the ledger gently on the service table nearest her, like laying down a piece of herself for the world to finally see. James Temp's face turned pale as his eyes locked on the aged book. For a brief second, his mask of control cracked, and the younger tellers, who had laughed only minutes earlier, instinctively stepped back as if afraid of what the truth might reveal. Eleanor reached back into the sack, pulling out a bundle of yellow dollar bills wrapped in string, each bearing the old Chase Bank logo currency from a forgotten era. The notes weren't just money. They were proof-haunting relics from a time that had tried to erase her. "These," she continued softly, "were the first deposits, my deposits, hidden for decades because I knew one day I'd need to show the world that I existed, that I mattered." Her eyes scanned the crowd, not with accusation, but with the deep, hollow calm of someone who had already lived through the worst, who no longer feared humiliation because there was nothing left to lose. "You all laughed when I walked in," she said gently, "and I expected that because people like you have always laughed at people like me until the truth arrives. And today, the truth has arrived. For the first time, no one laughed. No one even breathed." James Temp took a cautious step forward. The color drained from his face as his eyes darted between the ancient ledger on the table and the woman who stood so still, so composed, that she seemed to command the very walls around her. His lips parted, unsure whether to dismiss her or demand answers. But before he could speak, Eleanor placed one hand gently on the cover of the ledger, her fingers trembling not from weakness, but from the weight of the past pressing through her skin. "You want to know how this bank came to be?" she said, her gaze fixed on James, but loud enough for every soul in the room to hear. "Let me tell you what your history books refuse to write. In 1948, I co-founded this bank, a young black woman with a sharp mind and a dream too bold for her time. I had nothing but courage and savings earned from running a small bakery passed down from my mother. I partnered with John Williams, a white man I trusted, respected, and called my closest friend. Her voice faltered for a heartbeat, and her eyes momentarily glazed over, not with tears, but with the kind of pain that had carved permanent places into her heart. For the first few years, we worked side by side. I designed the policies. I attracted the first clients. I was here every day, cleaning floors, balancing books, greeting customers. And John, he was here too, until the bank began to grow. A beat of silence held the room in its grip as Eleanor's voice darkened. Lower now, not with bitterness, but truth carved like stone. That's when he changed. When the Matthews family, the wealth, the legacy took an interest in our little institution. They looked at me, a black woman in the co-founder's chair, and saw something they didn't like, something that didn't fit their vision of power. I remember the day clearly. They didn't threaten, they didn't scream. They just whispered to him, offered him something: status, safety, legitimacy if he would simply erase me. She closed her eyes for a moment, her fingers clenching slightly. And he did. He forged documents. He made meetings I wasn't invited to. He spread lies that I was unfit to lead, too emotional, too naive. He told the board I was an image problem. Then one morning, I came here and found the doors locked. My name scraped off the glass. My keys didn't fit. My office was emptied. And when I stood on these steps, begging for answers, they called me hysterical. Security escorted me out while people watched and said nothing. James's breath caught in his throat. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Around the lobby, not a soul moved. Even Stephen Miller, whose fingers still hovered near his holster, looked rattled, his confidence chipped away by the brutal clarity in Eleanor's words. I tried everything. She continued, her voice softer now. Courts, lawyers, letters, but I was told again and again, you have no proof. You have no power. You should be grateful you were ever let inside. She looked at each person now, her voice unwavering. They didn't just steal my bank. They stole my name, my place, my legacy, and none of you ever knew, because the truth was buried in silence. Her hand fell to her side, but her stance remained tall. But I never forgot. I kept the ledger. I kept the money. I kept the pain. And today I bring it all back to the place where it began. There was no applause, no objections, just silence so deep it seemed the walls themselves were listening. Eleanor stood unmoving, her frame still frail, but surrounded now by a presence that no one dared to mock. Her voice, though gentle, struck deeper than any scream. After they erased me, I spent years trying to reclaim what was mine. I took every scrap of evidence I had: ledgers, letters, financial records, and knocked on every door I could find. Local courts, city officials, lawyers who claimed to care about justice. But all I found were closed doors and cold stares. Her eyes, dark and shining beneath the bank's harsh ceiling lights, scanned the room slowly. In one courtroom, I was told I had no standing. In another, a judge didn't even look up from his papers before dismissing my case. He said, and I remember every word, "Miss Kirby, you should understand your place. A black woman running a bank. That's not how the world works." She let that sentence sit in the air like poison. No one moved. No one dared. The bank lobby felt colder, tighter, as if her pain had seeped into the walls and pulled every eye down in shame. Even Stephen Miller, the security guard who had once gripped his holster like a badge of pride, now seemed unsure where to stand. Every step I took, she continued, was met with silence, laughter, or locked gates. They said the documents weren't valid, that the bank was always owned by the Matthews family. They asked me to provide more proof, and when I did, they said it was too late, that the statute had passed, that my voice didn't count. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table gently, steadying herself not from weakness but from memory. I wasn't just denied justice, I was denied existence. Her voice wavered not with fragility, but the weight of half a century of struggle. They didn't just steal my business. They made the world believe I was never here to begin with. A murmur ran through the crowd, a low, unsettled rustle. A woman near the back pressed her hand to her mouth. A man lowered his eyes, ashamed to meet hers. The truth wasn't just uncomfortable, it was suffocating. Eleanor stepped back from the table, her presence now impossible to dismiss. "You look at me and see an old woman in a ragged coat," she said, but beneath this coat is the soul of someone who built something beautiful, only to watch it be taken, twisted, and renamed by those who thought I was too invisible to matter. She looked directly at James Tempe, whose hands now rested on the edge of the ledger, as if it were a burning truth he no longer knew how to handle. And yet, I'm still here. Her final words didn't rise in volume, but they thundered through the room louder than any siren. She was no longer just a disruption. She was history unburied. She was the reckoning they had never expected. The weight of Eleanor's words still hung heavily in the air as she slowly reached back into her battered canvas sack, her movements deliberate, her expression carved from unshakable resolve. Every eye in the room followed her hands with a magnetic pull. The once mocking crowd now bound to her every gesture by a tension they could neither explain nor escape. From deep within the bag, Eleanor drew out a thick stack of papers wrapped carefully in oilcloth, the kind used long ago to protect valuables from time's decay. She placed the bundle on the polished marble counter, and with hands that trembled only slightly, peeled back the worn fabric to reveal a set of documents yellowed by age but unmistakably official, seals, signatures, and typewritten lines faded yet legible, their authenticity stamped by history itself. These, she said softly, yet her voice carried with the weight of a hammer, are the original contracts, the founding documents of this bank. Here lies the evidence that my share was never sold, never forfeited, never given away. She carefully unfolded the top sheet, lifting it high enough for even those standing near the entrance to see. There, in bold, looping ink, were the signatures: Eleanor C.K, Kirby and John Williams side by side. Equal, undeniable. Not a single mention of the Matthews family. Not a single transfer of ownership bearing her name. Across the lobby, a shudder passed through the gathering like a cold wind. James Tempe, standing frozen behind the counter, felt the blood drain from his face as he recognized the documents for what they were: artifacts that could topple an empire. He instinctively reached out, lifting one of the papers closer to his eyes, as if hoping proximity would prove them false. But no, the paper was real, the ink was real, the truth was real. For decades, Eleanor continued, her voice calm but carrying an edge that sliced through the silence. They buried my name. They erased my legacy. They lived on what they stole. And all of you, she said, sweeping the room with a gaze that was not accusatory but heavy with disappointment, benefited from a lie. A wave of shame washed over the faces around her. Customers shifted uneasily. Bank employees exchanged guilty glances. Even Stephen Miller, who had gripped his holster with such bravado earlier, now let his hand fall uselessly to his side, the fire in his eyes extinguished by a reality he could no longer deny. Eleanor's hands, steady as a clock, laid out each document carefully across the counter, a silent procession of undeniable proof. The lobby was no longer a place of power and order. It had become a courtroom, a confessional, a battlefield where the only weapon was the truth, and the truth belonged to her. She met James Tempe's wide, disbelieving eyes with a quiet, devastating certainty. You can choose to look away, she said, but the truth will not disappear. Not this time. Not ever again. Her words didn't need volume to pierce the heart. They landed with the finality of a verdict. One, the bank, its people, and its history could no longer escape. For a moment, the entire lobby stood trapped in a heavy, stunned silence, the weight of truth settling like a storm cloud about to break. But not everyone was ready to surrender. In the far corner near the entrance, Stephen Miller's body tensed, his face twisted between disbelief and fury, his pride clawing violently against the truth that had just crushed the air from the room. His breathing quickened, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned ghost white. And then, in a sudden, violent motion, he reached for the gun at his hip, pulling it halfway from its holster with a sharp metallic rasp that sliced through the heavy stillness like a knife. Gasps broke from the crowd as bodies instinctively shrank back toward the walls, some customers ducking, others frozen with fear, all eyes snapping toward Stephen as he pointed the barrel squarely at Eleanor, his hand shaking but his voice barking orders with desperate rage. "That's enough," he roared, the gun trembling in his outstretched hand. "You're lying. You're trying to ruin everything we built here. You think a few scraps of old paper can tear this place down. Over my dead body." His voice cracked at the end, raw and splintered. Not the voice of a confident man protecting justice, but of a frightened one, protecting a crumbling illusion. Eleanor stood still, not a flicker of fear crossing her weathered face. her calmness so profound it seemed almost otherworldly against the gun now leveled at her heart. She looked at Stephen, the way one looks at a wounded animal, with a deep, patient sadness that stripped away all the bluster from his rage. James Temp, heart hammering against his ribs, instinctively moved closer, his palms raised in a trembling, placating gesture. "Stephen, put it down," James said, voice shaking but urgent, slicing through the thick air. "This isn't the way." But Stephen, his pride bleeding and his world unraveling, didn't seem to hear. His hand twitched on the gun. His mouth twisted into a snarl. "She's a fraud," he barked, voice hoarse. "She's making fools of all of you. Don't you see that?" No one answered him. No one moved. Not Emily Carter, whose hands were clasped tightly against her chest. Not Josh. Not the customers now crushed into the corners of the lobby. All of them had seen the documents. All of them had felt the undeniable gravity of Eleanor's words. Stephen was alone, fighting a battle that had already been lost. Eleanor's voice, when it came, was so soft that it forced Stephen and everyone else to listen. "You are not protecting justice," she said, each word slow, deliberate. "You are protecting a lie that hurt people like me, a lie that built a world you were told to believe in without ever questioning." Stephen's arm trembled harder now. His pride and his fear waging a war inside him he could not win. For a long, unbearable moment, it seemed the situation might tip into disaster. And then, with a deep, ragged breath, James Temp made his choice. He stepped between them, between Stephen's gun and Eleanor's unflinching form, and raised his voice, stronger than anyone had heard it before. "Stephen, I'm ordering you," James said, locking eyes with him, full of pain but also unbreakable resolve. "Put that gun down." The words cracked through the air like a judge's gavel. A long second passed, stretching so taut it seemed the world itself might tear apart. Then, slowly, Stephen's hand sagged, the gun lowering inch by inch as the weight of reality finally crushed the last of his defiance. His arm dropped to his side, his fingers uncurled. The weapon clattered onto the marble floor with a sharp, ringing sound that echoed through the stunned silence like a final surrender. The gun lay abandoned on the marble floor, its metallic clatter still reverberating in the thick, electric air of the lobby. But the real noise now was silence profound, staggering silence as every soul in the room turned toward James Temp. The young bank manager who had just crossed a line, no one expected him to dare. James felt the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes pressing into his back, the tremble in his hands betraying the avalanche of fear he fought to hold at bay. But his voice, when it finally rose, carried a resonance he hadn't known he possessed. He turned fully to face the room, stepping forward, placing himself firmly between Eleanor and the shaken remnants of a world that had spent decades pretending people like her didn't exist. "Everyone listen," James said, his voice steady despite the thunder pounding in his chest. "This woman, Mrs. Eleanor C.K. Kirby deserves more than our suspicion. She deserves our respect, our attention, and above all, our apology." Gasps rippled through the room, soft and sharp, like the cracking of thin ice. But James pressed on, his eyes bright with the fire of a conscience awakened. "I've seen the documents. I've read the signatures. I've touched the evidence with my own hands. Everything she says is true. This bank, this building we stand in, was founded on her dreams, her blood, and her sacrifice, only to be stolen away because of prejudice, because of greed, because it was easier to erase her than to honor her." His voice climbed, fierce and unwavering now, cutting through the layers of doubt and fear that still clung to the crowd. "We cannot pretend any longer. We cannot hide behind the legacy of liars and thieves who built their empires on injustice." His gaze swept the bank at the stunned tellers behind the counter, at the customers clutching their coats as if the truth might burn them, at Stephen Miller, who stood breathing heavily, shame and anger wrestling inside him. "If we continue to ignore this," James said, lowering his voice but sharpening it into something colder, something absolute, "then we are no better than those who stole her life's work in the first place." Eleanor watched him, her hands resting lightly on the documents spread before her, her expression unreadable yet brimming with something long denied recognition. She had seen many men like James before, men who chose silence when faced with hard choices. But here, now, he was choosing to speak, even knowing the cost. James drew a deep, shaking breath. He knew what he was about to say would change everything. "Starting today," he declared, each word deliberate, each syllable a hammer blow against decades of denial. I stand with Mrs. Kirby, and I will do everything in my power to make sure her story is heard, her rights restored, and her name carved into the foundation of this bank where it always belonged. A murmur broke out among the employees, low and uncertain at first, then growing a rumble of shifting loyalties and shaken hearts. Some faces turned away in shame. Some looked at Eleanor with newfound respect. Emily Carter, standing near the counter, was the first to step forward, her small frame trembling, but her eyes burning with conviction. "I stand with her too," she said, her voice clear in the stillness. Josh followed next, hesitating only a second before adding, "Me too." One by one, the tide turned, the frozen world beginning to thaw around Eleanor, as hands that had once filed papers of oppression now lifted in silent salute to truth. Eleanor stood straighter, her chest rising with a breath she hadn't allowed herself to take for more than half a century. In that moment, the storm inside the bank was not the end, it was the beginning. For a moment after James Temp's declaration, there was only a tense, fragile stillness, as if the entire lobby stood on the edge of something vast and irreversible. And then, like the slow, sure beginning of a landslide, others began to move. Emily Carter stepped forward first, her eyes locked on Eleanor with a fierce kind of reverence, and laid a hand over the stack of aged documents, a silent vow that she, too, would defend them. Josh followed, younger and less certain, but there was no mistaking the sincerity in the way he bowed his head slightly to Eleanor, a gesture of apology and respect. Then others, bank tellers who had once chuckled under their breath, security guards who had watched with suspicion, even customers who had initially clutched their purses tighter at the sight of Eleanor's worn coat, all began to step forward, one after another, until a thin but unbreakable line of support formed between Eleanor and the old systems of power that had once crushed her. Stephen Miller watched it unfold, his face a mixture of disbelief and fury. The last crumbling pillars of the world he believed in falling all around him. He took a step back, as if the truth itself physically repelled him, his hand twitching instinctively toward his empty holster. But there was no weapon left to draw, no authority he could summon to erase what everyone had now seen. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse, broken, barely more than a whisper. "You're all making a mistake." He spat, but the words fell like stones into an ocean, swallowed instantly by the rising tide of justice he could no longer hold back. Eleanor remained at the center of it all, silent and unmoving, not triumphant but solemn, as though she carried the weight of every soul who had ever been silenced, every dream stolen by prejudice and greed. She didn't smile, she didn't need to. The shifting room spoke louder than any victory parade. James turned to Stephen, his face no longer uncertain but carved from stone. "It's not a mistake, Stephen," he said quietly but with finality. "It's the only thing we should have done a long time ago." Stephen's shoulders sagged, his fight gone, his pride bleeding out onto the cold marble floor, where his gun still lay abandoned like a relic of an uglier past. Around them, the employees moved closer to Eleanor, forming a protective barrier, not of force but of unity. A wall of people who had once been complicit, but now chose to stand on the side of truth. And in the background, unnoticed at first, a few customers pulled out their phones, recording the moment not for scandal, not for entertainment, but because some moments are too important, too sacred to be lost to memory alone. The walls of Chase Bank, once impregnable with silence and complicity, were beginning to crack, not under the weight of violence, but under the heavier, unstoppable weight of truth. The air inside Chase Bank, once so heavy with fear and derision, now pulsed with a strange, raw energy, the energy of something ancient, finally breaking free. But even as support gathered around Eleanor like a slow-building tide, James Temp knew this was only the beginning. His heart still pounded painfully in his chest, not from fear of Stephen Miller anymore, but from a deeper, more insidious dread the Matthews family, the true owners of the bank's shadowed legacy, would not let this go quietly. James turned to Eleanor, who stood composed amid the circle of newfound allies, and for a moment he saw in her something far bigger than one wronged woman. He saw the embodiment of every lie buried by time and wealth, every truth too dangerous to be spoken aloud. And he realized that today's battle was a mere spark compared to the firestorm waiting ahead. As if summoned by his thoughts, his phone buzzed violently against his hip, the screen lighting up with the name he dreaded most, Richard Matthews. James didn't answer. He didn't have to. He could already hear the threats veiled behind a veneer of civility. The legal notices, The closed-door meetings, the sudden calls for his resignation, all the subtle and brutal ways power defends itself when threatened. Around him, the employees who had stepped forward glanced nervously toward the tall windows, as if expecting black sedans and grim-faced lawyers to appear at any second. Stephen Miller slumped against a wall, silent now, his failure carved deep into his face. But the real battle was no longer in the lobby. It was moving into courts, into headlines, into the very marrow of the town's identity. Eleanor seemed to sense the shift too. She gathered her documents quietly, wrapping them again in the oilcloth, with hands both reverent and resolute, as if arming herself for a much longer war. When she looked up, her eyes met James's with a clarity that stunned him. "They will come for us," James said in a low voice, barely more than a whisper, meant only for her. Eleanor smiled faintly, the kind of smile worn by those who had faced storms so many times that they no longer feared the lightning. "Let them," she said simply, and there was no bravado in her voice, only the unshakable weight of a lifetime spent surviving battles far crueler than this one. Across the lobby, customers continued filming quietly, understanding on some instinctual level that they were witnesses not to a scandal, but to history reshaping itself in real time. Eleanor's weathered fingers tightened around the bag on the counter as James stepped forward to address the gathered crowd once more. "This is not the end," he said, and though his words were simple, they struck the room like a solemn drumbeat. "This is the beginning. Chase Bank will have to answer for what it has hidden. The Matthews family will have to answer." And he looked around at the young employees, at the hesitant customers, at Eleanor standing like a monument to endurance. "We will not look away." Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped lower behind the town's skyline, casting long, twisted shadows through the glass doors, as if reminding them that the past, no matter how deeply buried, never stays silent forever. It didn't take long for the ripples that began inside Chase Bank to erupt into waves that slammed against the quiet streets of Rockview like a storm that no one could escape. Within hours, whispers of what had happened, of an old black woman stepping into the bank and revealing that the institution's very foundation was built on betrayal and lies, spread like wildfire, igniting conversations in cafes, sparking furious debates across dinner tables, filling social media feeds with fragmented videos filmed by trembling hands. The name Eleanor C. Kirby, long buried beneath layers of dust and silence, rose like a ghost reclaiming its place in the world. But not everyone welcomed the truth she carried. The Matthews family moved quickly, their lawyers descending like a black tide, issuing cease and desist letters, calling emergency meetings with the bank's board, launching aggressive public relations campaigns that painted Eleanor as a confused old woman, desperate for attention and clinging to fantasies. News articles funded by their influence began to appear, filled with words like alleged and unsubstantiated, attempting to drown Eleanor's truth beneath a deluge of polite disbelief. But it was too late. The videos of that afternoon of James Temp standing in front of a trembling gun to protect Eleanor, of the ancient ledger spread open under the fluorescent lights, of the small, silent revolution inside the bank had already captured the public imagination. People didn't just see documents. They saw the faces of injustice, the raw courage it took for a woman silenced for over 50 years to walk into the very institution that had stolen from her and demand the world remember. Journalists came from neighboring cities, setting up cameras outside the bank's polished glass facade. Protesters gathered with handmade signs that read, "Truth cannot be buried," and "We stand with Eleanor." Legal scholars debated on television whether the statutes of limitation could be challenged when the theft was so deeply rooted in systemic racism. Inside the bank, the atmosphere turned from tense to embattled. Some longtime employees resigned, unwilling to face the avalanche of questions and guilt. Others stayed, digging deeper into old archives, finding more dusty files that backed up Eleanor's claims, pieces of a puzzle that no one could deny anymore. James Temp became a reluctant leader, thrust into a spotlight he never sought but refused to flee, standing beside Eleanor at every press conference, every legal filing, every hearing. His career, once built on safe mediocrity, now burned brightly with a new and dangerous authenticity. Through it all, Eleanor moved like a steady flame, untouched by the chaos swirling around her. She refused every lucrative media offer, every sensational interview. She wasn't here to sell a story. She was here to reclaim a legacy. Standing on the courthouse steps as the first lawsuit against the Matthews family was officially filed, Eleanor addressed the sea of flashing cameras and straining microphones with a voice clear and unwavering. "This is not just about a bank," she said. "This is about every voice that was silenced, every dream stolen, every lie that was told and left to rot in the dark. Today, we begin to tear those lies down, brick by brick, page by page." The crowd erupted into applause, but Eleanor simply bowed her head slightly. Not in victory, but in solemn promise. She knew the real war was only just beginning. Months passed, and though the battle raged on in courtrooms and in headlines, something deeper, something irreversible had already shifted. The truth, once unleashed, refused to be buried again. The Matthews family's lawyers fought tooth and nail, spinning webs of technicalities and historical distortions. But piece by piece, document by document, witness by witness, the foundation they had built on silence began to crumble beneath them. Chase Bank, under relentless public pressure, was forced to issue an official apology acknowledging Eleanor C.K. Kirby as one of its rightful founders and pledging reparations not just financial, but symbolic. Her name was restored to the bank's historical records. Her portrait hung in the grand lobby where once she had been erased, and her story embedded into every employee's training, a permanent reminder that truth, though delayed, would always find its way home. On a crisp fall morning, a ceremony was held in front of the bank's imposing marble columns, now adorned with fresh banners reading "Honoring Our True Founders." Crowds gathered, cameras flashed, but Eleanor herself, frail yet proud, stood humbly at the center, a figure of quiet triumph. James Temp, standing beside her, introduced her, not with bombast, but with reverence, his voice steady as he declared, "We do not rewrite history today. We correct it." When it came time for Eleanor to speak, she stepped to the podium, her hands steady on the edges, her eyes sweeping the sea of faces before her. "This moment is not mine alone," she began, her voice firm despite the years etched into it. "It belongs to every soul who was told they were too small, too different, too invisible to matter. It belongs to those whose dreams were stolen before they even had a chance to bloom. And it belongs to the future to ensure that we do not build our lives on lies, but on truth, no matter how painful that truth may be." She paused, letting her words settle, not rushing, for she understood now more than ever the power of silence as well as speech. Justice delayed is still justice. If we do not give up, and her eyes gleamed in the soft morning sun. "I never gave up." Applause erupted, thundering and uncontained, but Eleanor merely smiled a small, knowing smile, her gaze lifting toward the sky as if offering a silent message to those who had come before her, those who had fought and fallen unseen. She knew this victory was not only for her, it was for them all. When the ceremony ended, she stayed behind for a moment, letting the crowd drift away, letting the noise recede until she stood alone once more before the building she had once helped to create and had once been cast out from. Slowly, she reached out and touched the cool stone near the entrance, her fingers brushing the new bronze plaque now embedded in the wall. Eleanor C.K. Kirby, co-founder, 1908. Her touch lingered there, not in bitterness, but in peace. She had carved her place back into a world that had once denied her existence. No amount of time, no wall of lies, no tide of prejudice could steal it from her again. When she finally turned and walked away, the autumn leaves swirling around her feet, she did so not as a forgotten relic of the past, but as a living testament to the unbreakable truth that some legacies, no matter how long they are buried, will always rise again. Justice may be delayed, truth may be buried, but the spirit of those who were wronged never fades. Eleanor C.K. Kirby did not just reclaim her bank, she reclaimed her name, her voice, and her place in history. Her story is a reminder to all of us. No matter how many walls are built to hide the truth, no matter how many hands try to erase it, someday someone will come back and tear those walls down. If Eleanor's journey moved you, if you believe that forgotten voices deserve to be heard, leave a comment below. Share this story with someone who needs hope today. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where truth and courage always find the light.